Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next session on decarbonising shipping. I am Catherine Brehek. I'm the environment editor here at The Economist. And with me today, I am delighted to be joined by Guy Platten, who is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping. Hello, Guy.
Hi.
We've also got Bud Dar, who is the Executive Vice President of the Mediterranean Shipping Company. Bud, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. And Jacob Melgaard, Chief Executive of TORM, which is a tanker company. So shipping is, as I understand it, roughly responsible for 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, one of the concerns is that that proportion is set to rise. Most of those emissions come from freight. And we now have, or we have had now for some years, this target set by the International Maritime Organization of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030. Is that correct? And aiming towards 70%. But there's also this target in the distance of actually 50%, at least 50% by 2050. So we've got a number of targets on the table, all of which seem quite difficult, given that the trajectory is still upwards. So, Guy, perhaps starting with you, how does the industry go about meeting these targets? What are the key challenges and what are the big milestones ahead?
Actually, we as an industry want to be more ambitious than the IMO targets, and we've committed to a net zero by 2050 as well. But to make that happen, a number of things have to happen sort of sequentially and all together at once. Firstly, there needs to be production at scale of zero carbon fuels for the ships to be able to use and utilise, and that's still quite a long way off. Just for shipping, we would take the entire renewable energy output of the world today in order to power shipping. So that does need to scale up. We need much more research and development to get the technology at the readiness levels ready to actually implement. We need some sort of market-based measure in order to incentivize the first movers and bridge the gap between the cost of production of the zero carbon fuels and the fossil fuels which they'll be replacing. And finally, we also need to make sure we upskill our workforce to be able to deal with the new fuels and the new technology that's going to be utilized in order to make it all happen. So it's a number of things have to happen, and we also need the political and the regulatory backup to make sure we have the right market signals to make sure this all happens.
So a lot on the plate there. Maybe let's start with fuels, because fundamentally the emissions in shipping come from the fuels. Right now, that's all, well, the vast majority is fossil fuels. There are few alternative options. But your company obviously burns these fuels in its ships. What are the options on the table? How do you see this evolving over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I'll start by saying that the three options you have right now today are you can enhance the energy efficiency using the conventional fuels that we have available in the marketplace today. The second is to use biofuels, but you also have to be very mindful of the sustainability of the origin of those biofuels as well, and be prepared to certificate that to see how you can quantify the actual net reductions you get from that. And then the third thing is LNG. All of the things beyond that in the future, which we need, and that's what we're working towards, are more complicated or all in development. And so of those, there are biosourced in particular. I think biosourced methanol has real potential, and I think that biosourced LNG has real potential as substitute fuels to supplement those ones that we have available today. And then as we move farther down range, and this is more complicated because you need the intermediate step of building up all of that renewable power that Guy was referring to get to green hydrogen as a feedstock, to either use green hydrogen as a fuel, although that's very complicated because its volumetric density characteristics and its handling characteristics don't really lend itself to large scale, long duration sea voyages. But then the derivatives that can come from that as a feedstock, instead of just as a fuel, would be green ammonia, which has some real promise, although it's got safety aspects that really need to be addressed in a very serious way before we can actually deploy them. But it definitely has promise and has a role for us. And then there is synthetic methanol, which definitely has longer term potential, but it's complex and it takes this additional manufacturing step, including finding a carbon source and combining that with hydrogen and oxygen to make ethanol. And then there's synthetic LNG, which also can use that green hydrogen as a feedstock to, again, combine with carbon through some mechanism to actually create a synthetic form. All of those things hold real promise. All of those things are a ways off, both in production and in creation of a midstream and delivery. All of those things are not things ship owners can do themselves. We're really good at what we do. We don't do that. And that's really where we need the help of governments to create the right environment that incentivizes, either through a carrot or a stick or both, the development, production, and delivery of these fuels, and making sure that we get our share of them so we can truly decarbonize to net zero by 2050, as Guy had said, and my company fully supports that as well.
So we'll come back to the role of governments at a later stage, but for the minute, I'd like us to sort of explore which of those technological solutions holds most promise. I'm interested in all of your views on that. Jacob, we haven't heard from you yet, so maybe you could start. What does that future look like?
Yeah, I think both Bart and Guy clearly put out that it's a complicated equation that we got ahead of us. I think there's this around the existing technologies where clearly it's a responsibility, I think, for all of the actors in shipping to do as much as we can already today. And as you pointed to, Catherine, the 40% relative reduction by 2030 set by the IMO, we, for instance, here in TORM, believe that can be done better. So we've put ourselves sort of on the spot and said we want to be reducing by that 40% already in 2025, because there's a meaningful difference, obviously, in aggregate over time on CO2 emissions when you reach these targets, but it can be done. Then when you look further out, as you point to, I really think that we need to explore all of the ways. Clearly hydrogen, and therefore the derivative of that, ammonia, would be the one that is the go-to. In the interim, there are these other fuel types, methanol, potentially LNG, that can bridge some of this. But the investment part that also Guy pointed to is really that I think the shipping community, ship owners, and all the actors there are actually ready to step up and take on the challenge of meeting zero emissions by 2050. However, if we look at the whole investment portfolio that is needed, required by that ecosystem, it's close to, let's say, a little more than 10% of the investments in that ecosystem that is required to be into technologies that has to do with ship owning, i.e. the ships, and it's close to 90% that is actually getting to the fuel types, whether it is methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, derivatives of this. It's so the vast investment that is needed into this, meeting the 2050 criteria of zero emission from shipping, it has to do with the infrastructure. It's actually not on the ship owner. So we cannot do this ourselves. You pointed to, Catherine, we'll come back to the role of regulators. I think that the ecosystem itself can go some way to actually starting up with testing these new technologies and demonstrating the viability in the coming decade.
Yeah, it might actually help to get a sense of where things stand right now. You talked about testing it. We've had some news from Maersk this year. Maybe you could just sort of lay out where things stand right now. I don't know who wants to take that on, or I'll assign it. Go on, Bud.
I don't mind at all. And in answer to your question of which fuel is going to hold the most promise, we need them all, in my opinion. And we can't be ruling any out that have some promise, because we need volumes, and we have different characteristics and designs of ships and their deployments that we have to take into account. So what we're doing now as a company, I think mirrors what the industry is doing. I mean, we're a very large operator with well over 700 ships in our network. So we've got to solve this problem multidimensionally to make it work. We are currently working on developmental projects that include for methanol, both retrofit and new build, that include LNG with a progression from fossil LNG to synthetic and bio LNG, because I think fossil LNG has some drawbacks that are going to make its benefits look less and less over time if we can't migrate to bio and synthetic. That'll be a problem for those ships. So we're working actively on developing supply chains for that. The molecule's the same. So if you can use fossil-based LNG with the equipment you've got or the delivery network you've got, you can use synthetic and bio with no further modification. When it comes to methanol, which I mentioned, you need to be a little cautious about it because the conventionally produced methanol right now, you certainly can buy, and the pricing is such in the market at the moment, it doesn't look like a future fuel. And the reason why is its upstream footprint doesn't really get you where you need to go. So you really need to get the next generation of green, whether it's bio or synthetic methanol. Again, hinges on getting the fuel, but the technology to actually use those fuels is pretty well proven already, particularly in, say, 4-stroke medium speed engines, but also the engine OEMs are working very hard to make sure that we're in a position for slow speed, larger engines as well. So that's coming along just fine. I think with hydrogen and ammonia, the technology will be there to consume those fuels, certainly in an internal combustion engine. And we have OEMs working pretty hard on ammonia because they know there's a need for that, and making sure that we get some test bed data and know what's actually necessary in order to use that fuel for consumption. Storage and materials, some more work has to be done too. But with hydrogen, it gets a little bit complicated because although it no doubt could be burned in an internal combustion engine, hydrogen has the most potential if we can get a significant scale up in fuel cells to go with that. To date, the most ambitious installations I've seen for fuel cells are talking about maybe 6 megawatts. That's not really a lot of power for a large ocean-going ship, and that is really ambitious. So we need something much more than that to really untap the potential for hydrogen as a fuel that could be there, so we can carry less of it and make it a possibility for more ships, and particularly those that don't have the option to maybe refuel every day because maybe they're going back and forth to the same point. One last point I'd like to make, sorry, Catherine, is we've talked about the options that we can see right now. We've talked about the options we have in hand right now, but let's not rule out anything for the future. And let's keep an open mind about maybe a return to sail power in some applications, because in some applications that can have value, or supplemental wind power as well. And also, let's not rule out the next generation of nuclear power that could be possible. I think from a technical perspective, it has a lot of merit, whether you're talking about molten salt reactors or potentially maybe even fusion reactors. Those are not the type of reactors that have been used over time in naval applications. This is a different generation of that. And I think we need to be looking at that with an open mind and see whether or not the policy and regulatory framework meets the technical merits, which I think will not actually be that hard to bring together eventually.
That's a huge number of options on the table. And I'm wondering what, I can see Guy sort of nodding, I'm wondering what your fellow panelists think about how you manage all of that given the timescales. I mean, we're looking at infrastructure that takes ages to be built, then has a lifespan that is also on the order of decades. And yet the targets that we're talking about are now, I mean, on those timescales, they're basically tomorrow. So how do you explore all of these options while at the same time meeting the deadlines?
If I may, perhaps just on that one, I think the real issue is how are we going to produce whatever zero carbon fuels are of the future at the scale we need to not just power our industry, but to power the world. And you've got to remember as well that we're going to be competing with many other industries for these same fuels. So, and I really don't think people have fully grasped the enormity of the problem that lies ahead for us. There's a lot of rhetoric that goes around, but I mentioned just for shipping alone would take all the renewable energy now in order to produce the synthetic fuels of the future, and that's just our industry, which is 3%. If you of the emissions now, so you just think about the steel industry and other industries, it's going to be a massive challenge. We're doing a mapping exercise now, which we hope to have completed later on this year with the University of Manchester, to actually see what governments have said in rhetoric in terms of what they're going to do and what their actual plans are in terms of the infrastructure and the scaling up of the production of these fuels, and to see where we are for that as well. But the challenge is enormous, and I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all anyway. I mean, Bud's named quite a few different fuels. I think they'll all have their place in some way. We also battery power as well, and certainly on the short sea routes have been proven now with some ferries and other things like that. So I don't think, at the moment we've got it quite easy in the sense there's only one sort of fuel that we use generally, and we're going to have multiple fuels with multiple infrastructure that goes with it. So, the problem is huge. We're ready to solve it. We're ready to do our bit, absolutely. But we do need governments and others to step into the breach here and do their part. And as Jakob said, 10% shipping, 90% others have got to in order to make this work.
Jakob, I wonder if you want to jump in on that, on this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Guy is onto something here that we really shouldn't forget, is that we are part of a global ecosystem. I really feel that shipping needs to step up, like I believe that a lot of like-minded people in the industry is actually already doing, and try to improve wherever we can. However, the competition for these energy sources in the hard-to-abate industries will be really tough. And I think we should be mindful of that you actually, on a global scale, needs to allocate that into the sectors where you get most value, i.e. where you deplete most of the CO2 emissions that we have today, in order to get in total on a global scale, get the minimum CO2 emissions as we move on and progress. So I think currently it's really too early to call, both, as you point to, Karin, what are the winning fuels of the future for shipping, but also how much of the fuels that will be made available should actually go into shipping. And this is not to take away the responsibility of shipping to be ready to do everything if it is available, but it may be that it is better for other industries to actually take a bigger part of that in order to have the total equation of CO2 emission on a global scale down.
So I completely appreciate the point. It does feel a little bit like pushing the buck off to another industry, because presumably, if I can just continue that, if I understand well, so the fuels need to be developed and then, scaled up, commercialized, etc., then allocated or bid for, somehow distributed across the different industries. But in the meantime, you guys need to build the ships and the infrastructure that is going to fuel those ships.
And that should be taken already now, those steps, because obviously these assets have a lifetime, as you're also indicating, Catherine, here, of let's say 20, 25, or even for certain sectors, 30 years. So this is something that should be taken serious already now. The technology is there to have vessels that can both be burning the current fuel types and at the same time be ready to take the e-fuels when they're available. So I think that is totally our responsibility to build that capacity, to build that optionality into a fleet. But mentioned some of the examples are, and that can be done. That technology is there, both from engine manufacturers, from shipyards, and from investor side, to make exactly that choice already now, so that when the e-fuels are sufficiently available, that you can shift over. I think that's our responsibility. Then what I'm pointing to is the obvious, that we all, I think, as global citizens, should aim for that the e-fuels that is being now produced in not sufficient to source everybody is sourced into the industry where you abate the most CO2 emissions already now. And if it's shipping, it should be done into shipping. If it is into, let's say, metal production, whatever, cement production, then my opinion is it's better to use it there first. And then once you've got more and sufficient of the fuel types, then you go into other industries. And if shipping is the first in line, it's absolutely us who should have it.
And if I could add, I think society will ultimately, make that choice as to where their priority is. My point is, we want to do this. We're committed to do this. We're prepared to be in the front of the line. But if you don't give us the access to the fuels, we won't be able to do it. And when it comes to infrastructure, I agree with everything Jacob said about what we need to do with the ships. But the shoreside infrastructure is not for us to build. Ultimately, as the customer and the consumer, we have to expect the private part of those costs anyway will be borne by us one way or another, just as it has been in developing LNG infrastructure to get delivery of the fuel onto our ships. But things we can do right now, and again, I just refer to Jacob's comments because I think they were spot on. We need to start making the investments today to be able to adapt, maybe not even just to one future fuel, but maybe more than one fuel, because the picture can continue to evolve over time. And the lifespan of these assets, which are very expensive, a modern cruise ship, for example, we're the third biggest cruise operator in the world, is about €1 billion and maybe has a 30 to 40 year lifespan. The right answer 10 years from now might not be the best answer 20 years from now. So we are delivering ships today and ordering ships for the future that will have adaptability for different fuel types. So, for example, we have some ships that are prepared to be adapted for green methanol if that appears on the horizon sooner rather than later. We have ships that can use not only fossil, but of course, bio and synthetic, because that's the way LNG works when it comes to that particular fuel. And then also with regard to ammonia, we're ordering some ships now that will have some adaptability to ammonia as well in the future. What you can't do for most of these e-fuels is develop and install the complete package right now. Because some of the technology is still lagging a bit, but the technology is very much leading the race right now over delivery of those actual e-fuels of the future.
I hadn't realized how diverse. Sorry, guys.
I'm just saying, I think that commitment that Bud's company and Jacob's company have made, you heard it, that's replicated many times over by many other companies. There's a real commitment there to get to net zero by 2050. But there's obviously, we mustn't underestimate the challenges that lie ahead in terms of making that happen. But in terms of the investments that are being done, it is happening now. But we need also other people to step in to assist on this pathway in order to achieve the goal.
And sorry if this is a stupid question, but those ships that are adapted to multiple different fuels or are sort of future ready, as it were, they can still operate today on current fuels. So it's not sort of sunk costs here.
No, if I may.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, so over and above what you have, you sort of have a feature that you can operate on dual fuel. As Bud also mentioned, you might even can do 3 types of fuel. So you simply have storage facility either already prepared on board your asset, or you can retrofit it at a marginal additional cost, but the engine itself is ready to simply operate on 2 or even 3 types of fuel. That technology is ready already now and is being utilized for the new investments, because obviously investors here in this community is also thinking about that you don't want a stranded asset. You don't want an asset that you're building, let's say, by 2025, you can get a new vessel in whatever vessel class, and you have fast forward, let's say, another 20 or 25 or even, as in Bud's case, 40 years ahead of you. You really want to be able to have this optionality, and you pay just an extra for that optionality already today.
Yeah, Jacob, I was going to make a comment very close to your last point, which is we're paying a premium today for de-risking the investment going forward, having some uncertainty over what the most reliable and effective alternative fuel paths are going to be. But we are making those investments, and we're making them at a very large scale in our cargo division as well as our cruise division. And it's the best thing that you can do, even if the technology is not quite complete yet. So an ammonia is a good example. we're pretty sure we know how we can use ammonia in the future in an internal combustion engine, and an internal combustion engine that exists today. But the testbed data and the actual development of the injectors that are needed, which is the primary piece of equipment for the consumption, that's still a story that's yet to be completely written, but it's written enough where you can make a ship in a way where it could be adapted reasonably well, because you know what materials it takes for the storage and handling, and you can think about that for the future. And those are the types of things that we're doing today. We'll fill in the gaps in the future as the technology catches up and aligns with what the fuel mosaic really looks like for that particular ship type.
So you've all alluded to the role of governments at various points in your comments. As I understand it, the IMO has very little in the way of teeth. So what are the carrots and the sticks here? How do you see that picture evolving? And don't all jump in at once.
If I may, the IMO has teeth if governments choose to give it teeth. So the IMO is a global regulator. It sets the global regulations, anything from life-saving appliances through to marine pollution, so if the governments wanted to make it happen, it can happen. And that's the great thing about our industry, is we have this global regulator. But of course, what's happening is a bit of an impasse within IMO at the moment, with different competing countries deciding what they want to do. So we then have some regionalisation of some of these measures. For example, the EU ETS, and we know there's other regional schemes in terms of emission trading is being set up elsewhere around the world, or is in sort of being planned. So it is an opportunity with IMO to get the global regulation we need to do it. But that needs the willingness of governments to make that happen, to make the compromises needed to ensure that we get that global regulation. So, and I think our frustration is that process seems to be stalling at IMO at the moment. And we're, for once, industry is actually ahead of the regulator. Industry wants to make this happen. We need the regulator now to step up.
What's the reason for which it's stalling?
Because different countries have different priorities. So depending where you come from. So some countries want to be very progressive. Other countries are more traditional and want to see how things pan out. You've got developing economies who feel that they're being asked to pay the price that the developed economies who actually did put the CO2 in the air in the first place. So you have all this playing out on a macro level within the IMO. But what we need to know is coalesce around a sort of a future, and that will need compromise from all parties in order to make that happen. So we've been advocating for a market-based measure. We get it, we absolutely understand. In order to reward the first movers and to bridge the gap between the low carbon, zero carbon fuels and the fossil fuels, there needs to be some sort of carbon price, and we accept that. But that's still a long way off getting agreement for that in IMO. As an industry, we put forward a proposal, mandatory $2 a tonne of current fuel to go towards research and development and infrastructure development. But that was turned down last week by the IMO. And that was industry saying, we'll quite happily pay this, and $2 is a starting point, but we'll go up from there. But that was kicked into touch. So we really do need governments now to show the same leadership at the regulated side of it as they are when they're making rhetorical speeches at COP26. So that's perhaps my cynic in me, is that there's a different audience have been played to, but we need to make this happen, and that's what we're crying out for as an industry. Is that I think we had a conference at COP26 where a large ship owner said, "We want more regulation." Now, how many business leaders say that, really?
And I was an IMO delegate, a national delegate for quite some time, and IMO is very, very good at solving technical problems, and you could make this a technical problem. There are aspects of this that could be solved in a technical manner. But what has happened, not only with greenhouse gases, but also the whole environmental picture within IMO, is it has become much more a political discussion and much less a technical discussion. And by necessity, when it comes to greenhouse gases, that is a microcosm of the bigger debate around the equities of climate change actions worldwide that have absolutely nothing to do with shipping. And governments have stumbled over themselves in IMO because they haven't resolved these bigger issues between the equities between developing and developed countries. And there was no good reason for us not to be allowed to have the framework to spend the $2 billion per year, $2 per ton, that would add up to $10 billion in the initial proposal to help research and development. There was no good reason for it other than it got in the way of some of these bigger policy prerogatives that center around greenhouse gas equities at a macro level. It's unfortunate. We're kind of held hostage to it. In the meantime, not only have we done what Guy said and called for a global carbon pricing and a market-based measure, but we've called for net zero for 2050. We're looking over our shoulders at governments and saying, where are you? Come join us. We need them to.
Jacob, did you want to jump in on that?
No, just really a follow-up on Guy's point about this. I was very much pro this initiative around the R&D for this because it simply makes sense. And we initiated this idea in 2018. Yes, I understand that it's last week that IMO said no, but there is no other reason than exactly the way Bud described it, that you have this geopolitics around certain member states in the IMO that obviously just say, hey, there's nothing in this for me, so we're not gonna be backing this. But I wanted to make one other point is that you kind of phrased it, that the understanding of the IMO is kind of this teethless organization, and yes, there are definitely issues. I think that we have to accept that currently there are the coalition of the willing also among member states, not only in our shipping industry. There's clearly a divide between the companies that are very vocal about their ambitions and participating in, for instance, this opportunity to talk with you today. And then there's others who still believe that it's better to not be part of it. Clearly, the same is going on within the IMO when you talk about greenhouse gas emissions. And there, I think we will see that this coalition of the willing, the countries that really is serious about this and taking it to the next level and being sort of the front runners, they will implement, whether we like it or not, local regulation also around emissions that will also regulate shipping. That's not what we want, but I think personally that is what we're going to get, and I think that will then drive eventually the broader theme of global regulation, but only at a later stage. So we'll have to, unfortunately, go through a number of processes and a number of years where we will be sort of having an inefficient, at a global scale, an inefficient local regulatory bodies around also CO2 emissions.
So this doesn't, you're saying this doesn't necessarily require a global regime. Ultimately, in the long run, yes, but it could start through a sort of coordinated regional approach. Is there a geographical location in particular for those who are not sort of familiar with the politics of shipping?
I can have a stab at it, Guy. But I mean, the EU will start. I think the US is right behind. I'm not sure whether I'm offending anybody here, but I think they will probably be the likely runner-up. And then, honestly, I think China will also think about how they will then want to put their mark on this. A little depending on, where the current government is on this and what strategies they put forward for the coming years. But that could be another place where you would see that that local regulation would also come into play.
I would just add that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I would add that unlike most of the other pollutants that we talk about, or emissions that come out of a stack that have localized impacts, what's unique about greenhouse gas emissions is it doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Durban, South Africa, or Geneva, Switzerland, or Beijing. A gram of CO2 in the atmosphere or emitted to the atmosphere has the same impact. So it is truly a global problem that needs a global solution. And if we're serious about it, we do need to find a global solution. And I think that the likelihood of governments acting on their own, whether it's the couple that Jacob mentioned or whether it's other ones, having any sort of a coordinated regime out of their individual, regional, or national equities being applied into law is very, very low. And I think we could find ourselves with an extraordinarily difficult operating environment as well as challenging paradigm as to how we actually solve the environmental problems too. I think would be really harmful if we end up in that place. And I really hope that governments will be willing to work together rather than to just work independently and then try and merge all that later, because I don't know that it can be merged later once governments get too entrenched in regional and national regimes. That being said, just as there's a role for ship owners to be early movers, there's a role for governments to be early movers and show what's in the realm of the possible, and then bring those proposals to a global level to try and emulate them and try and coordinate them. But that step, if it doesn't happen, is going to create a very, very difficult world for us to figure out how to operate in.
So we've only got a few minutes left, and I had a question that relates to some of my other interests that I wanted to throw out to you. Shipping is one of those industries that is in the list of hard to abate sectors, along with, I mean, you've mentioned a few: cement, steel, airline industry. And these are the sectors that this whole nebulous possible unicorn on the horizon of negative emissions refer to. So the notion that come 2050 for the global net zero, there will have to be some kind of an industry that is prepared at scale to remove large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere in order to compensate not just for some past emissions and some overshoot, but also importantly for the sort of remaining emissions from possibly shipping, amongst others. I'm wondering, given that discourse, to what extent the shipping industry feels like it needs to get involved in negative emissions.
It's a fantastic point. And Catherine, a lot of people, when people discuss, for instance, what is that we need to do, you pointed to IMO's targets 2030. We got a target reduction, another by 2050. Actually, as Guy pointed to, that's set by the industry to be net zero. And then let's not forget that our children and their children, they need to then start having a negative CO2 accounting figure every year from 2050 onwards to meet the Paris Accord. So direct air capture, these technologies, clearly, when I look at the cost picture of that, I think it's daunting what we need to do in terms of getting to zero with all the investments we've been debating in this session. And then it is mind-blowing what you then need to be getting to in terms of then leaving not only the zero, but getting into a negative territory on this. But I don't have, we've not created, at least I can hand on heart say, we've not created a strategy around that in Danish shipping or in TORM at this stage.
But is it something that shipping should get in, that the shipping industry should get involved in, since it's, you could say, there to clean up your emissions?
I don't know that I put it quite that way, Catherine, but I do think we should be involved, and we are. And when you talk about a net zero fuel, in a lot of cases, that's exactly what we're talking about doing, which is removing CO2 from the atmosphere to combine with something else that will be a different fuel. So several of these fuels we've talked about have that characteristic already, as do some of the production methods of fuel. So when you talk about the blue range of fuels, that's pretty much what they're talking about. Also on the shipboard side, I know that's a technology that we're looking at pretty closely. And I think that we need to be familiar with carbon capture and storage technology and how it can be applied not only to our sector, but maybe to the benefit of all of society. And I think we could be part of that solution set for sure, whether it's through purchases or whether it's through application or R&D that we support.
And I think as well, on a positive note as well, shipping is going to play its role in delivering these zero carbon fuels around the world. They're going to be producing some fatty locations which are going to have to be moved to the market. So shipping, there's an opportunity for shipping to play its role in helping the rest of the world to decarbonise and show that leadership there. So, what you have got is a real commitment from the vast majority of our industry to making this happen.
Right. Well, we've unfortunately run out of time, so I'd love to actually press you a little bit more on that, but maybe we'll have to do that on offline. In the meantime, thank you very much, all three of you, for participating today. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please stay tuned for the next session.